Hey everybody, Greg Barron here, professor of real estate. Thanks for joining today. And today I'm feeling a little bit academic. You're going to want to stick around because we're going to talk about inflation, where it started and what it's doing. Stay tuned. So this last week I was trying to explain why inflation is at 2% and what effects it are having on our economy right now in a less academic way, and try to bring some analogy to the whole reasoning behind inflation. And I had this one student ask me, he said, so who created this 2% inflationary target that we have? And I said, that's a really great question. So many people ask that, as I did early on. And did you know the origin of that is not even rooted in the United States? Back in the late 1980s, there was a finance minister of New Zealand, of all places, that went public on TV and said, New Zealand's target rate of inflation is going to be 1%. And for some reason, the rest of the world stuck to that. Fast forward to 2012, and the Fed chairman at that time stated that from that point on, the target inflation rate that they would try to shoot for would be 2%. That, ladies and gentlemen, is how 2% inflation target first originated. Now, you could be asking, isn't there some academic reason globally, and especially in the United States, with all the PhDs we have that codify all this information, that they came up with this 2%? As far as anybody can find, the answer is no. So inflation is something that we've lived with as investors our whole careers. We learn about it in economics. We talk about it in business school. We have to deal with it in our everyday calculations. We even use it as a variable, as we have escalation clauses as predictive tools in determining our expenses that might escalate because of inflation. Everybody is concerned about inflation, but what really is it? What causes it? And more importantly for us investors, what can we do to understand it, to take opportunities to invest for the future so that we'll be able to have better economic returns than a lot of people in the market? So first of all, let me just say this. Inflation is definitely a disease. It is a disease that is very destructive. It's a disease that has basically toppled countries. History is replete with countries that have been taken down by inflation. You go back to after the First War, and Germany, Russia, Austria, all those countries had to pay for reparations after the fact. Some had to borrow, like Germany, others printed. The fact is that all of those countries were almost destroyed internally and financially because of inflation. You look back to the 60s and you point to Brazil. You look to Chile. You look to Venezuela. You look to Mexico. All of those countries have been affected by inflation. So the question is, just who controls inflation? And I like to look back at one of my heroes of economics, which is Milton Friedman, back in the Reaganomics days of supply-side economics. He was very much a capitalist. He was very much a free market type of person. But Friedman made a good point over and over again. After we were coming through this inflationary cycle, the presidency of Jimmy Carter had basically pushed interest rates up into high teens. Inflation was out of control, and we had to do something to stymie it, to create some kind of vehicle so that inflation would be crushed. So Milton Friedman at that time gave a whole series of discussions. He was in huge demand to talk about two things, primarily money supply and inflation. And a few things that Friedman said over and over again is inflation is a disease, and it is not created by anybody or anything other than the federal government. Now, from an academic standpoint, I had to try to understand, why is it that my purchasing power is affected by government spending? And it actually is very simple. When you think back, let me give you a recent example of the pandemic. We had a huge amount of government spending, stimulation into the economy. Everybody wanted dollars from the government. Hey, I'm included. We benefited from that pandemic period. Not so sure we should have, but we benefited from government stimulus. Everybody was very happy to have it at the time. Where did that money come from? Well, it came from the printing press of Washington. And anytime you stimulate the economy such as that without taxation, you are going to have the potential for inflation. That's kind of a dumb moment. You've heard that from a lot of people over the last couple of years. This is what we have to live with as a cause and effect of printing money. So it's basically a monetary phenomena where you have more money that's printed than economic output. Let me give you an analogy. It's similar to what Friedman told back in his day, and I'll bring it up to date. But let's say that I've got a small fortune and I want to take some time off, and I leave it in the hands of my stockbroker, and I hop on my yacht and I set sail for some remote island. I get stranded. I get stranded for 20 years. I have no contact with the world, but I have enough sustenance to survive for those 20 years. Somebody finds me, they bring me back, and the first thing I do is I call my stockbroker and I say, well, how do we do? And he says, you'll never believe it. You're a millionaire many, many, many times over. And I said, oh, that's fantastic. At least that's good news from being stranded for 20 years. And he said, yes. And by the way, you owe me $150,000 for this 5-minute phone call. That in itself is how the cause and effect relationship works with inflation. So again, inflation is a monetary phenomena where there's too much money and not enough output. So in essence, too, inflation is a printing press phenomena. The crazy thing is we're the ones who control it. We control the elected officials. We cast our vote. We have the opportunity to change it. But the problem is nobody wants to be taxed. So inflation serves as a tax. Another way of saying this, and it's somewhat overused when we talk about this, is inflation is a tax that we don't vote for. Here's the problem. Everybody wants to stop inflation, but they particularly want to stop it at somebody else's expense. I want to take you back to just what happened post-pandemic. Everybody benefited from the stimulus, and this is not a political statement saying that we didn't deserve it or we didn't need it. There are some people who survived through it. But you just can't print that much money and not have a cause and effect relationship to inflation. So really what we're feeling today are the after effects of the government spending. And especially in a political year, and we're not getting into the politicizing this, but let's just face it, there's not a politician out there that wants to talk about raising taxes. So they don't. Neither party. What do? They spend. They print. When they print, it increases the money into the system. When they increase the money into the system, it dilutes the value of the dollar. When it dilutes the value of the dollar, it purchases less. When it purchases less, you have to charge more. When you charge more, you have an inflationary cycle. So we have the ability to stop inflation. The challenge is not too many people want to be on the butt end of the cure. But before I lose you and you think I'm off on some kind of political witch hunt, I'm really not. I'm just trying to explain the fundamental issues of inflation and how inflation can affect you. And more importantly, you need to be smart on how you can capitalize on inflation, how you can invest in hard assets to take advantage of inflation. That's why those of us who are in the real estate business really have done a deep dive into the establishment of how money's created, how it works its way through the system, and how it can further affect us in the future to grow our wealth. So again, I'll go back to my study of Friedman, who basically coined these analogies that I'm getting ready to say, but I've lived by them for the last 35 years. Inflation has a cure. It has a cure. But the problem is the cure has issues that we don't want to deal with. We do want to deal with it if somebody else has to pay for it and it doesn't create any burden on us. And let me give you an example. It's like alcohol. Alcohol is good effects to begin with, but you wake up and suffer the bad effects later. And there's a cure to alcohol. But if you're subject to alcohol, your consumption ability goes up as you use it more and more, meaning the more you use alcohol, the less effect it has on you, so you've got to use greater and greater amounts. Now, if you get too accustomed to alcohol, i.e. alcoholism, there is a cure. There is a cause and effect, and there's a cure to inflation. The bad effects come first, and the good effects come later. They're the polar opposite of what I just talked about by first enjoying alcohol, the good effects followed by the bad effects. Inflationary issues have cures, but like most things, it takes a constriction of money, it takes the velocity of money to decrease into the system, which creates bad effects first, which most people don't want to deal with, which ultimately will create good effects further down the road. What we have working against us right now is the political headwinds where we want to stimulate the economy and not have to tax for it. But there is an effect. It's always a cause and effect. So anytime you hear about government spending, whatever it is, whether it's recently I heard that when the Baltimore Bridge was hit by the tanker, that the government came out and said, we're going to pay for the rebuilding of it. Whether it's student loan debt, we're going to totally absolve student loan debt and the government's going to pay for it. Whatever government spending it is, paying for other wars in other countries, just know that the government has two choices, print it or borrow it. And right now they're printing it. And what's going to happen is it's going to be a continual dilution of the purchasing power, which is going to further hamper the ability for inflation to come under control. Now, let me speak to inflation just a second. Now, I'm not saying that inflation shouldn't exist. It's existed my whole life. What I'm saying is we have the opportunity to control it. I feel that the one major thing that causes a spike of inflation is the velocity of how it's controlled. I'm of the camp, like a lot of people, that say the rate hikes came way too late and way too quick in velocity. And I think that's one thing that affects inflation really is not the number, whether it's 3.9 or 3.5 or wherever it settles in right now. It's the velocity of the control that the government imposes to control it that really affects it. By and large, we probably could live with 5% inflation. It normalizes. It increases over time. We learn to adjust. Wages adjust over time. Price points adjust over time. Inflation doesn't have the devastating effect that it does when you have this massive increase, this massive velocity of changing to the amount of money that's taken out of the system or put in the system. It could work either way. So let me tie a bow on inflation and let you know that I still feel the number one investment as a hedge against it is real estate. I'm going to continually choose to invest in this real asset because I know that historically it's been able to stay ahead of the inflationary cycles that we have and produce greater returns that I have in some other asset classes. And you can become an expert at it. So I hope some of this information on inflation has helped. It is not politicized. I wanted you going into this political year to understand that anytime that you hear about government spending without taxation, just remember that that causes a dilution of the purchasing power of money, and it very well could be followed, unless you're taxed, which in a political year you won't be. It will have the tendency to continue to make pushing it down to this arbitrary 2% rate very stubborn. So I would really like to hear from you about this subject. Inflation is somewhat academic. It's somewhat of a gut feel. And as I've just discussed, it's a very arbitrary, non-academic figure at 2%. But I do want to hear from you. I want to hear what your opinion is on inflation. Have you got some other comments that you want to discuss in the forum? And be sure and hit the like and subscribe button so that we can continue to create content. We want to hear from you as what we should address in the future. Even if it's to debate this particular aspect that I've talked about, it's something that we're going to have to deal with for now and for the years to come. So let's talk about it. I'll try to get to as many questions as I can. And remember, as we always say on the channel, educate, evaluate so that you can ultimately execute to increase your own personal wealth. Thanks for being here today. We'll see you soon.